It was supposed to be the highlight of their sixth grade year, but since that crisp October morning in 1994, no one has ever discovered what happened to the 15 children who vanished during a field trip to Yosemite National Park. The small town of Pine Ridge, California, nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about 60 miles from the park, had a population of just under 3,000 people. Most families had lived there for generations, working in the lumber mills or small family farms that dotted the valley. Pine Ridge Elementary School was a modest single-story building constructed in the 1960s, with 8 classrooms, a small library, and a cafeteria that doubled as an auditorium for school plays and community meetings. The school served children from kindergarten through 8th grade, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson had been the principal for 12 years and took pride in knowing every student by name, along with their parents and grandparents. The 6th grade class of 1994 was particularly special to the community. 15 bright, energetic 11 and 12-year-olds who had grown up together since kindergarten. They were the heart of Pine Ridge's future. There was Tommy Martinez, the class clown who could make anyone laugh even on the worst days. Sarah Chen, the quiet bookworm who dreamed of becoming a scientist. Jake Morrison, the star athlete who was already being scouted by the middle school football coach. Maria Santos, the aspiring artist who filled every notebook margin with intricate drawings. The list continued with Emma Thompson, Michael Rodriguez, Ashley Johnson, David Kim, Jessica Lopez, Ryan O'Connor, Nicole Brown, Christopher Lee, Amanda Wilson, Brandon Taylor, and Samantha Davis. Each child was unique, each was loved, and each had dreams that would never be fulfilled. The field trip to Yosemite had been planned for months. Mrs. Patricia Williams, their beloved teacher who had taught 6th grade at Pine Ridge for 8 years, believed in hands-on learning experiences. She had organized the trip as the culmination of their science unit on geology and ecosystems. The children had spent weeks studying the formation of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the unique granite formations of Yosemite Valley, and the diverse wildlife that called the park home. Permission slips had been sent home in September, and every parent had eagerly signed them. For many of these children, it would be their first visit to the famous national park, despite living relatively close to it. The $45 per student cost had been a stretch for some families, but the Parent-Teacher Association had organized fundraisers throughout the previous year to ensure no child would be left behind. The plan was simple and seemingly foolproof. They would leave Pine Ridge Elementary at 7 a.m. on Friday, October 14, 1994, in the school's yellow bus driven by Harold "Hal" Peterson, an experienced driver who had been with the district for 15 years. They would arrive at Yosemite Valley by 9:30 a.m., spend the day exploring various educational sites, including Tunnel View, Bridal Veil Fall, and the Valley Visitor Center, and return to Pine Ridge by 6 p.m., well before dark. Mrs. Williams had coordinated with the National Park Service to ensure they had all necessary permits and had arranged for a park ranger to give them a special presentation about the geology of the valley. She had also recruited 2 parent volunteers, Dr. Robert Chen, Sarah's father and a local physician, and Ms. Janet Morrison, Jake's mother and a registered nurse. Both parents had taken the day off work to help supervise the children and provide medical support if needed. The morning of October 14th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and not a cloud in the sky. The first hints of autumn were showing in the oak trees around Pine Ridge, and the air had that crisp quality that promised a beautiful day. The children arrived at school by 6:45 a.m., bundled in jackets and carrying packed lunches their parents had prepared with extra care. The excitement was palpable. Many of the children had never been on an overnight school trip, though this was just a day trip. They chattered nervously about what they might see, whether they would spot any bears, and if they would be able to take pictures at the famous viewpoints they had studied in their textbooks. Mrs. Williams conducted her usual pre-trip safety briefing, reminding the children about staying with the group, following instructions from adults, and being respectful of the natural environment. She had prepared a detailed itinerary that included bathroom breaks, lunchtime, and educational stops, all carefully timed to ensure they would return to Pine Ridge before dark. Hal Peterson performed his standard pre-trip inspection of bus number 47, a 1989 Bluebird that had been well maintained by the district's transportation department. The bus had been serviced just 2 weeks earlier and showed no signs of mechanical problems. Hal filled out his daily inspection checklist, checking tire pressure, oil levels, brake function, and emergency equipment. Everything was in perfect working order. The parents who had gathered to see their children off noticed how responsible and mature the kids seemed that morning. There was none of the usual chaos of a school morning. Instead, there was an air of excitement mixed with respect for the importance of the trip. Several parents commented later that their children had seemed more grown up that day, as if they understood they were embarking on something special. At exactly 7 a.m., bus number 47 pulled away from Pine Ridge Elementary with 18 souls aboard, 15 sixth graders, their teacher Mrs. Williams, parent volunteer Dr. Chen, and driver Hal Peterson. Ms. Morrison had called in sick that morning with what she described as a severe migraine, reducing the adult supervision by one person. But Mrs. Williams felt confident that she and Dr. Chen could handle the group. The route to Yosemite was well established and familiar to Hal Peterson. He would take Highway 49 north for about 20 miles, then turn east on Highway 120, which would take them directly into the park through the Big Oak Flat entrance. The total journey time was approximately 2.5 hours, accounting for the winding mountain roads and a planned rest stop in Groveland. The first indication that something was wrong came at 9:45 a.m. when Mrs. Williams failed to call the school office to confirm their safe arrival at Yosemite, as was protocol for all field trips. Mrs. Henderson tried not to worry initially, assuming they had hit traffic or that Mrs. Williams was simply busy getting the children organized for their first activity. By 10:30 a.m., Mrs. Henderson's concern had grown enough that she tried calling the park's visitor center to inquire if the Pine Ridge Elementary group had arrived. The park ranger she spoke with checked the day's scheduled groups and confirmed that the Pine Ridge students were expected, but had not yet checked in. This was unusual, as school groups were required to register upon arrival to receive their educational materials and orientation. Mrs. Henderson then tried to reach the bus directly. Each school bus was equipped with a CB radio for communication with the district's transportation department. However, her attempts to raise bus number 47 met with silence. She tried multiple times over the next hour, using different radio channels and asking other bus drivers to attempt contact. Nothing. By noon, when the group should have been well into their educational program at Yosemite, Mrs. Henderson made the decision to contact the California Highway Patrol. She reported a missing school bus carrying 15 children and 3 adults, last seen leaving Pine Ridge at 7 a.m., bound for Yosemite National Park. The CHP immediately initiated a search along Highway 120, the most direct route to Yosemite. State troopers were dispatched to drive the entire route, looking for any signs of bus number 47 or evidence of an accident. They checked with the CHP dispatch centers in Modesto, Merced, and Madera counties to see if any accidents involving a school bus had been reported. None had. The search expanded quickly. By 2 p.m., the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department had joined the effort, along with park rangers from Yosemite. Search teams began combing not only the main highway, but also secondary roads and logging trails that Hal Peterson might have taken if he had experienced mechanical problems or gotten lost. As word spread through Pine Ridge, parents began gathering at the school. The initial hope was that the bus had simply broken down in an area with no radio coverage and that the group was safe but unable to communicate their situation. However, as the hours passed and the professional search teams found no trace of the bright yellow bus, that hope began to fade. By 4 p.m., with sunset approaching and still no sign of bus number 47, the search became a full-scale emergency operation. The California Office of Emergency Services was notified, and additional resources were requested. Helicopter search teams were dispatched to cover areas that ground crews couldn't access, and the National Park Service mobilized all available personnel. The parents of the missing children had gathered in the school cafeteria, where a crisis counselor from the county had been brought in to provide support. The families sat in stunned silence, holding each other and staring at the phones, waiting for news that never came. Some parents had driven their own cars along Highway 120, desperately searching for any sign of their children. Mrs. Henderson had set up a command center in her office, coordinating with law enforcement and trying to provide information to desperate parents. The school district's superintendent had arrived from the county seat, along with representatives from the state education department. By evening, local news crews had begun to arrive, drawn by reports of 15 missing children. The search continued through the night, with powerful spotlights illuminating the mountainous terrain along the route to Yosemite. The California National Guard was called in to provide additional aircraft and personnel. Search dogs were brought from as far away as Los Angeles, and volunteer search and rescue teams from across the state began arriving in Pine Ridge. The investigation officially began that first night, led by Detective Linda Martinez of the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department, a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in missing persons cases. Her first step was to interview everyone who had seen the bus leave Pine Ridge, trying to establish the exact time of departure and the direction they had taken. Detective Martinez also began background checks on all the adults who had been scheduled to be on the trip. Hal Peterson had a clean driving record spanning 15 years with no accidents or violations. Mrs. Williams was a respected teacher with no disciplinary actions in her file. Dr. Chen was a prominent member of the community with no criminal history. Even Ms. Morrison, who had called in sick, was thoroughly investigated and found to have been genuinely ill at home with witnesses who could account for her whereabouts. The search area expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of rugged Sierra Nevada terrain. Teams checked every possible route between Pine Ridge and Yosemite, including old mining roads, logging trails, and even hiking paths that a bus couldn't possibly navigate. They found nothing, no skid marks, no broken glass, no pieces of yellow metal, no sign that bus number 47 had ever passed through the area. On the second day, Saturday, October 15th, the story made national news. CNN, ABC, NBC, and CBS all sent crews to Pine Ridge to cover what was being called the Yosemite Mystery. The small town was suddenly flooded with reporters, camera crews, and curiosity seekers, all wanting to know how 15 children and a school bus could simply vanish without a trace. The FBI was called in on Sunday, October 16th, when it became clear that this was no ordinary accident or mechanical breakdown. Special Agent Karen Walsh, a specialist in child abduction cases, took over the federal investigation. Her first step was to expand the background checks to include any known sex offenders in the area, anyone with a history of crimes against children, and any individuals who might have had grievances against the school or the families involved. The investigation revealed some troubling information. In the weeks leading up to the field trip, several residents of Pine Ridge reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, including a dark blue van that had been spotted near the school on multiple occasions. However, despite extensive efforts, investigators were unable to locate this van or identify its owner. There were also reports of suspicious phone calls to the school in the days before the trip. According to Mrs. Henderson, someone had called asking detailed questions about the field trip schedule, but when she asked for the caller's name and reason for the inquiry, the person had hung up. She had mentioned this to Mrs. Williams, but neither of them had thought much of it at the time. By the end of the first week, the official search had covered over 1,500 square miles without finding a single clue. The FBI had interviewed more than 200 people, including every resident of Pine Ridge, all school employees, and anyone who had been in the area on October 14th. Roadblocks had been set up throughout the region, and every vehicle matching any possible description had been stopped and searched. The families of the missing children appeared on national television, pleading for information and begging anyone who might know something to come forward. The footage was heartbreaking. Mothers holding photographs of their 11-year-old children, fathers fighting back tears as they described their kids' hopes and dreams, grandparents who couldn't understand how their grandchildren could simply disappear. A reward fund was established, starting with donations from the Pine Ridge community and quickly growing as contributions poured in from across the country. Within 2 weeks, the reward for information leading to the safe return of the children had reached $500,000. Tips began flooding in from across the United States, with reported sightings from California to Florida. Each tip was investigated thoroughly, but none led to any concrete evidence. The investigation revealed that bus number 47 had been equipped with a GPS tracking device, a relatively new technology in 1994 that the school district had installed as part of a pilot program. However, when investigators checked the tracking data, they found that the signal had been lost shortly after the bus left Pine Ridge. The last recorded position was approximately 5 miles north of town on Highway 49 at 7:23 a.m. This information was puzzling to investigators. The GPS signal shouldn't have been lost unless the device had been damaged or deliberately disabled. The tracking company confirmed that the device had been functioning normally and that there had been no technical problems that could explain the signal loss. As the days turned into weeks, the intensive search was gradually scaled back. However, the investigation continued, now focusing on the possibility that the disappearance had been planned and executed by someone with detailed knowledge of the area and the school's procedures. The FBI brought in psychological profilers who created a detailed analysis of the type of person who could have carried out such an operation. The profile suggested someone with extensive knowledge of the local terrain, possibly someone who lived in the area or had worked there. The person would likely be organized, patient, and capable of planning a complex operation over an extended period. They would also need access to a location where 18 people and a large bus could be hidden without detection. By Thanksgiving 1994, 6 weeks after the disappearance, the active search had been officially suspended, though the case remained open, and investigators continued to follow up on leads. The families held a memorial service at Pine Ridge Elementary, attended by hundreds of people from across the state. The gymnasium was filled with flowers, photographs, and tributes to the missing children. The case generated numerous theories over the years. Some investigators believed the bus had been ambushed by a criminal organization involved in human trafficking, though no demands or communication had ever been received. Others suggested that the group had encountered some kind of natural disaster or geological event that had trapped them in an underground cave system. A few conspiracy theorists propose more outlandish explanations, including alien abduction or government cover-ups, but these were quickly dismissed by serious investigators. The FBI continued to investigate the case as a criminal matter, operating under the assumption that the children and adults had been abducted by one or more individuals with criminal intent. The families never gave up hope. They formed a support group that met monthly, sharing information and keeping the case in the public eye. They lobbied for new search technologies, funded additional private investigations, and traveled across the country following up on reported sightings of their children. Mrs. Henderson retired early in 1995, unable to cope with the trauma of losing 15 of her students. The school district brought in grief counselors to help the remaining students and staff process the tragedy. Pine Ridge Elementary was never quite the same. The empty sixth-grade classroom was kept exactly as it had been on October 14, 1994, with the children's desks arranged just as they had left them. The case went cold for years, though it was never officially closed. Periodically, new leads would emerge: a reported sighting, a piece of evidence found by hikers, a deathbed confession from someone claiming knowledge of the crime. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none led to any resolution. In 1999, 5 years after the disappearance, the FBI created a task force specifically to re-examine cold cases involving missing children. The Pine Ridge case was one of the first they reviewed, using new investigative techniques and technologies that hadn't been available in 1994. However, even with these new tools, investigators were unable to uncover any new evidence. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance in 2004 brought renewed media attention to the case. Several television documentaries were produced, including a segment on unsolved mysteries that generated thousands of new tips. The FBI created a new age progression images showing what the children might look like as young adults, but none of these efforts led to any breakthroughs. By 2010, many of the original investigators had retired, and the case was largely forgotten by the general public. However, the families continued their vigil, and a new generation of investigators occasionally reviewed the files, hoping to find something that previous investigators had missed. The digital age brought new possibilities for the investigation. Social media platforms were monitored for any mention of the missing children, and facial recognition software was used to scan millions of photographs posted online. Cold case podcasts and true crime enthusiasts on the internet kept the story alive, generating new theories and occasionally uncovering previously overlooked details. In 2020, 26 years after the disappearance, the FBI announced that they were once again actively investigating the case using advanced DNA technology and artificial intelligence to analyze the thousands of pieces of evidence collected over the years. They also created a new digital reconstruction of the bus's possible route, using satellite imagery and geographical analysis to identify areas that hadn't been thoroughly searched. It was this new technology that would eventually lead to the most significant breakthrough in the case since 1994. Advanced ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR scanning technology allowed investigators to examine areas of Yosemite that had previously been inaccessible or too dangerous to search thoroughly. The breakthrough came in the fall of 2024, exactly 30 years after the children had vanished. A team of researchers using advanced cave mapping technology in Yosemite National Park made a discovery that would finally provide answers to one of America's most enduring mysteries. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, was conducting a routine survey of previously unexplored cave systems in the park when her equipment detected an anomaly in the rock formations near Tunnel View, one of the areas the children had been scheduled to visit on their field trip. The readings suggested a large void space behind what appeared to be solid rock. Further investigation revealed a hidden cave system that wasn't marked on any maps and had never been officially documented. The entrance was concealed behind a rockfall that appeared to be natural, but upon closer examination showed signs of having been deliberately arranged. Access to the cave required specialized climbing equipment and expert knowledge of the terrain. When a search team finally entered the cave on November 3, 2024, They made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and provided closure for families who had waited 30 years for answers. Hidden deep within the cave system, in a large chamber approximately 200 feet underground, was bus Issue 47. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez had spent 15 years exploring cave systems throughout the American Southwest, but nothing had prepared her for what she found in the hidden chamber beneath Yosemite National Park. The yellow school bus sat in the darkness exactly as it had been positioned 30 years earlier, preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the underground cavern like an artifact from another time. The bus was intact, but showed clear signs of having been driven into the cave, rather than falling or sliding in by accident. The front wheels were positioned straight ahead, the emergency brake was engaged, and the keys were still in the ignition. Most haunting of all, personal belongings were scattered throughout the interior, backpacks still hanging on seat backs, lunchboxes on the floor, and a small stuffed animal that one of the children had brought for comfort. Dr. Rodriguez immediately contacted the National Park Service, who in turn notified the FBI. Within hours, the cave was secured as a crime scene, and a team of federal agents and forensic specialists was assembled to begin the most complex investigation in the history of Yosemite National Park. Special Agent Michelle Thompson, who had taken over the case from the now-retired Agent Walsh, led the federal response. Agent Thompson was a specialist in cold cases and had been studying the Pine Ridge disappearance for 3 years, ever since the FBI had renewed its active investigation. She had read every file, interviewed every surviving witness, and visited Pine Ridge multiple times to understand the community and the families affected by the tragedy. The logistics of investigating a crime scene 200 feet underground presented unprecedented challenges. Every piece of equipment had to be lowered into the cave using specialized rope and pulley systems. Powerful lighting rigs were installed to illuminate the bus and surrounding chamber. Air quality monitors were deployed to ensure the safety of the investigation team, and communication systems were established to maintain contact with the surface. The initial examination of bus 47 revealed several crucial pieces of evidence. First, the odometer showed exactly 47. 3 additional miles from the last recorded mileage in the school district's maintenance logs, far more than the 5.7 miles between Pine Ridge Elementary and the point where the GPS signal was lost. This indicated that the bus had traveled a significant distance after leaving the main highway. Second, the fuel gauge showed the tank was nearly empty, despite having been filled the morning of October 14, 1994. Hal Peterson's fuel logs showed that bus No. 47 had departed with a full tank, approximately 60 gallons, which under normal driving conditions would have been sufficient for the round trip to Yosemite with fuel to spare. Most significantly, forensic examination revealed that the steering wheel, gear shift, and driver's seat showed evidence of having been operated by someone other than Hal Peterson. DNA evidence collected from these surfaces, while degraded after 30 years, was sufficient to determine that at least 2 different individuals had driven the bus, neither of whom matched Hal Peterson's genetic profile. The search of the bus interior yielded heartbreaking evidence of the children's final moments. Several of the students had apparently written notes during their ordeal, scratching messages into the metal walls and windows using keys, coins, and even fingernails. Tommy Martinez had carved "Help us please" into the back of a seat. Sarah Chen had used her mechanical pencil to write, "Tell my parents I love them," on a notebook page that was found pressed against a window. The personal belongings recovered from the bus provided a snapshot of typical 11- and 12-year-olds from 1994. There were Tamagotchi virtual pets, packs of Pokemon cards, portable CD players with headphones, disposable cameras loaded with pictures of the children's excitement before the trip, and homework assignments that would never be completed. But the most significant discovery came when investigators examined the area around the bus more carefully. In a smaller chamber adjacent to where bus number 47 was found, they discovered evidence of a temporary camp, sleeping bags, camping equipment, empty food containers, and what appeared to be restraints that had been cut and discarded. Dr. Patricia Williams's teacher's bag was found in this secondary chamber, and inside it was a detailed journal that she had apparently kept during their captivity. The journal entries, written in her careful teacher's handwriting, provided the first real insight into what had happened to the Pine Ridge students after they vanished. According to Mrs. Williams's journal, the bus had been intercepted on Highway 49, approximately 6 miles north of Pine Ridge, by 2 men in a pickup truck who had forced Hal Peterson to stop by blocking the road. The men were armed and had apparently been waiting specifically for the school bus. They ordered everyone off the bus except for Hal, whom they forced to drive while one of the kidnappers followed in their truck. Mrs. Williams wrote that the children had been terrified but remarkably brave. She described how they had huddled together on the bus, with the older students comforting the younger ones. Dr. Chen had tried to negotiate with the kidnappers, offering his medical services and attempting to understand their motives, but the men had refused to communicate beyond giving basic orders. The journal indicated that they had driven for approximately 2 hours on increasingly rough roads before arriving at what Mrs. Williams described as a hidden entrance to some kind of cave or mine. The children and adults were forced to walk through a narrow opening in the rock face, while one of the kidnappers drove the bus into the cave system using a route that was apparently known to him. The cave system was extensive, with multiple chambers connected by tunnels that had been enlarged and modified over time. Mrs. Williams speculated in her journal that the location had been used before, possibly by the same kidnappers or others engaged in criminal activities. She noted that there were supplies already stored in the caves: food, water, camping equipment, and what appeared to be communications equipment. Most disturbing were Mrs. Williams's descriptions of the kidnappers' behavior. They seemed to be waiting for something, checking their radio equipment regularly and making what sounded like coded communications with someone outside the cave. They provided basic food and water to their captives, but refused to explain their motives or demands. The journal entries became increasingly desperate as days passed. Mrs. Williams documented the children's physical and emotional deterioration as they realized they might not be rescued quickly. She wrote detailed observations about each child, noting their fears, their attempts to maintain hope, and their efforts to support each other. On the 4th day of captivity, according to the journal, everything changed. Mrs. Williams wrote that the kidnappers received some kind of communication that appeared to upset them greatly. They began arguing in hushed tones, and one of them left the cave system, promising to return, but never coming back. The remaining kidnapper became increasingly agitated and paranoid. He accused the hostages of somehow communicating with the outside world and began talking about cleaning up loose ends. It was at this point that Mrs. Williams's journal entries became frantically desperate, with handwriting that deteriorated as she wrote under stress and in poor lighting conditions. The final entry in Mrs. Williams's journal was dated October 22nd, 1994. 8 days after the children had vanished from Pine Ridge. It was brief and chilling. He says we know too much. God help us all. If someone finds this, please tell our families we love them and we tried to stay strong. Tell them we were brave. Oh, the forensic investigation of the cave revealed evidence that supported Mrs. Williams's account. Investigators found the remains of the camping area where the hostages had been held, including improvised bedding for 18 people, empty food containers consistent with the timeline described in the journal, and evidence of the communications equipment that the kidnappers had used. More grimly, they found evidence of violence in the cave system. Bloodstains were discovered in multiple locations, and forensic analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to several of the victims. The pattern of blood evidence suggested that the murders had taken place over a period of several days, indicating that not all of the hostages had been killed at the same time. The investigation into the cave system itself revealed crucial information about how the crime had been planned and executed. The cave was not natural, but was actually part of an abandoned gold mine from the 1800s that had been sealed and forgotten for over a century. The entrance had been carefully concealed and was accessible only to someone with detailed knowledge of the area's mining history. Research into the mine's history revealed that it had been owned by the Morrison Mining Company until 1897, when it was abandoned after a series of accidents and financial difficulties. The mine had been sealed by the county in 1903, and all records of its exact location had been lost when the county courthouse burned down in 1918. This information led investigators to a crucial realization. Whoever had planned this kidnapping had extensive knowledge of local history and geography. They had found and prepared the mine as a hiding place well in advance, modifying the tunnels to accommodate a school bus and stocking it with supplies for an extended period. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a new profile of the perpetrators based on this evidence. They were looking for at least two individuals, probably local residents or people with strong connections to the area, who had access to historical records and mining expertise. One of them likely had mechanical skills sufficient to modify the cave system and operate the communications equipment found at the site. The breakthrough in identifying the kidnappers came from an unexpected source. Among the belongings recovered from the cave was an old wallet that had apparently been dropped by one of the perpetrators. Inside the wallet was a driver's license that had expired in 1992, issued to a man named Robert Bobby Morrison, a name that immediately caught the attention of investigators familiar with the area's history. Bobby Morrison was the great-grandson of James Morrison, the founder of Morrison Mining Company and the original owner of the mine where the victims had been found. Property records showed that the Morrison family had retained ownership of several parcels of land in the area, even after the mining operations had been abandoned. Further investigation revealed that Bobby Morrison had grown up hearing stories about the family's mining operations and had spent much of his youth exploring the abandoned mine shafts and tunnels on family property. He had intimate knowledge of the cave systems and had apparently spent years preparing the site for some kind of criminal enterprise. Morrison had a criminal record dating back to the 1980s, including convictions for burglary, assault, and weapons violations. He had served time in state prison and had been released in 1993, just 1 year before the kidnapping. More significantly, investigators discovered that he had been working as a janitor at Pine Ridge Elementary School for 6 months in 1994, giving him access to detailed information about school procedures and the planned field trip. The second kidnapper was identified through DNA evidence found in the cave. The genetic profile matched Walter "Walt" Jenkins, a longtime associate of Morrison who had served time with him in state prison. Jenkins had an even more extensive criminal record, including convictions for armed robbery and child endangerment. Both Morrison and Jenkins had died years earlier, Morrison in a car accident in 1997 and Jenkins from a drug overdose in 2001. This explained why the case had remained unsolved for 30 years. The perpetrators had taken their secrets to their graves, and without their confessions or testimony from surviving conspirators, investigators had been unable to piece together the crime. The motive for the kidnapping remained unclear, as no ransom demands had ever been made and no communications from the perpetrators had been intercepted. However, investigators discovered evidence that Morrison and Jenkins had been involved in a larger criminal network that included drug trafficking and weapons smuggling operations throughout Northern California. The prevailing theory was that the kidnapping had been planned as part of a scheme to demand ransom money, but something had gone wrong in the early days of the crime. The communications equipment found in the cave suggested that the kidnappers had been in contact with accomplices outside the cave system, but the identity of these accomplices remained unknown. Analysis of Mrs. Williams' journal and other evidence suggested that the kidnappers had panicked when their outside contact failed to return or respond to their communications. Rather than risk exposure by releasing the hostages, Morrison and Jenkins had made the decision to eliminate all witnesses to their crime. The recovery of the remains was a painstaking process that took several weeks to complete. Each victim was carefully documented and removed from the cave system by teams of forensic specialists and coroners. The remains of all 15 children, Mrs. Williams, Dr. Chen, and Hal Peterson, were eventually recovered and identified through dental records and DNA analysis. The condition of the remains provided additional evidence about the timeline and method of the murders. Forensic analysis indicated that the killings had taken place over a period of 4 to 5 days, beginning approximately 1 week after the initial kidnapping. The victims appeared to have been shot, consistent with weapons that Morrison and Jenkins were known to have possessed. For the families of the victims, the discovery of the cave brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. After 30 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones. However, learning the details of their children's final days was almost more painful than not knowing. The parents who were still alive, many had passed away in the decades since 1994, were notified personally by FBI agents before the news was released to the public. Some expressed gratitude for finally having closure, while others struggled with the knowledge that their children had suffered during their final days. The discovery made international news, with coverage by major networks and newspapers around the world. The story of the 15 children who had vanished on a field trip and been found 30 years later in a hidden cave captured the public imagination and renewed interest in other cold cases involving missing children. But for the tight-knit community of Pine Ridge, the discovery marked the end of a 30-year nightmare and the beginning of a new chapter focused on healing and remembrance. The question now was how to honor the memory of the children and adults who had been lost, and how to ensure that their story would never be forgotten. The news of the discovery broke on November 15, 2024, exactly 30 years and 1 month after the children had vanished. FBI Special Agent Michelle Thompson held a press conference at the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department, standing before a room packed with journalists, family members, and law enforcement officials from across the state. The weight of 3 decades of investigation was evident in her voice as she announced that the Pine Ridge Elementary School case had finally been solved. After 30 years of searching, we have located the remains of all 18 victims of the October 14, 1994 kidnapping, Agent Thompson announced. While we cannot bring these children and adults back to their families, we can finally provide the answers that have eluded us for 3 decades. The families of the victims had been notified privately before the press conference. Of the original 30 parents, only 14 were still alive to hear the news. Time had not been kind to many of them. Several had died from stress-related illnesses, others had succumbed to alcohol and drug problems in their grief, and some had simply given up hope and withdrawn from the world. Maria Santos, now 68 years old, had never stopped believing that her daughter Maria would someday come home. She had kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it was in 1994, complete with the art supplies and half-finished paintings that 11-year-old Maria had left behind. When Agent Thompson called to inform her of the discovery, Maria Santos wept for 3 hours straight, not just for her daughter, but for all the years of hoping and waiting that had finally come to an end. "I always knew she was waiting for us to find her," Mrs. Santos said through tears. "She was such a patient child. She could wait forever if she had to." The Chen family had perhaps suffered the most in the years following the disappearance. Dr. Robert Chen had been on the bus when it vanished, leaving behind his wife, Linda, and 2 younger children. Mrs. Chen had been forced to raise 8-year-old Kevin and 6-year-old Amy alone while dealing with her own grief and the community's questions about why her husband had volunteered for the trip. The family had eventually moved away from Pine Ridge in 1998, unable to cope with the constant reminders of their loss. Kevin Chen, now 40 years old and a father himself, had dedicated his life to search and rescue work, inspired by the futile efforts to find his father and sister. When he received the call about the discovery, he was leading a training exercise for new volunteers in Colorado. He immediately took leave from his job and drove straight to California, arriving in Pine Ridge for the first time in over 20 years. "I never stopped looking for them," Kevin said. "Every missing person case I worked on, every search I participated in, I was really searching for Dad and Sarah. I kept thinking that maybe if I saved enough other families, somehow it would bring them back." The Morrison family faced a different kind of pain. Jake Morrison's mother, Janet, who had called in sick the day of the field trip, had lived with survivor's guilt for 30 years. She had always wondered if her presence might have changed the outcome, if another adult might have been enough to deter the kidnappers or help the children escape. Now 74 years old and battling early-stage dementia, Mrs. Morrison struggled to understand the news about her son's discovery. Her daughter Carol, who'd been Jake's 8-year-old sister in 1994, had become her mother's caregiver and the keeper of Jake's memory. Carol had started a foundation in Jake's name that provided sports equipment to underprivileged children, believing that her athletic brother would have wanted to help other kids pursue their dreams. "Mom always blamed herself for not being on that bus," Carol explained. "She thought she could have protected him. I tried to tell her that she would have just been another victim, but guilt doesn't listen to logic." The investigation into the full scope of the criminal network that had planned the kidnapping continued even after the discovery of the victims. FBI agents worked with counterparts from the DEA and ATF to trace connections between Bobby Morrison, Walter Jenkins, and other criminal associates who might have been involved in the planning or cover-up of the crime. Financial records from the 1990s revealed that Morrison had received several large cash payments in the months leading up to the kidnapping, payments that couldn't be traced to any legitimate source of income. Bank surveillance footage from October 1994, recently digitized and enhanced with modern technology, showed Morrison making unusual cash deposits just days before the field trip. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the kidnapping might have been connected to a larger conspiracy involving corrupt officials in the county government. Morrison's criminal associates had apparently paid bribes to certain officials to ensure that investigations into their activities were delayed or misdirected. Former Mariposa County Sheriff Deputy Tom Bradley, who had retired in 2010, was arrested in December 2024 on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy after investigators discovered that he had deliberately steered search teams away from areas where the cave might have been discovered. Bradley had received regular payments from Morrison's criminal network throughout the 1990s and had used his position to protect their operations. This was bigger than just 2 criminals acting alone, Agent Thompson explained to reporters. There was a network of corruption that allowed this crime to be planned and executed, and then helped cover it up for 30 years. The recovery of the victims' remains from the cave was completed in January 2025. Each victim was carefully documented and prepared for burial by forensic specialists working with local funeral directors. The process was complicated by the condition of the remains after 30 years, but advanced forensic techniques allowed investigators to provide definitive identification for all 18 victims. The community of Pine Ridge, now a city of nearly 8,000 residents, came together to plan memorial services that would honor the victims while providing closure for their families. The town had grown significantly since 1994, with new housing developments and businesses, but the elementary school remained largely unchanged, serving as a somber reminder of the tragedy. Pine Ridge Elementary School had been renamed the Pine Ridge Memorial Elementary School in 1995, and a small monument had been erected in the playground listing the names of the 15 missing children. The 6th grade classroom, where Mrs. Williams had taught, had been converted into a memorial room, preserved exactly as it appeared on October 14, 1994. Principal Susan Martinez, who had taken over from Mrs. Henderson in 1996, had maintained the memorial room for nearly 30 years, ensuring that each new generation of students learned about the tragedy and the importance of safety and vigilance. The room had become a place of pilgrimage for families affected by child abduction cases across the country. These children and their teachers deserved to be remembered not just as victims, but as the bright, hopeful young people they were, Principal Martinez said. They had dreams and plans and futures that were stolen from them. We owe it to them to make sure their memory lives on. The formal memorial service was held on February 14, 2025, which would have been Valentine's Day, but was designated as a day of remembrance for the Pine Ridge victims. Thousands of people attended the service, including family members, former classmates, law enforcement officials, and representatives from missing children's organizations across the country. The service was held in the Pine Ridge Community Center, which had been built in 2000, with donations from people around the world who had been touched by the story of the missing children. The center's main hall could accommodate 2,000 people, but overflow seating was needed for the hundreds of additional attendees who came to pay their respects. Each victim was remembered individually, with family members and friends sharing memories and reading letters that had been written to them over the years. The most moving tribute came from the classmates who had been left behind in 1994. Now in their 40s, these individuals had carried the memory of their friends for 30 years, wondering what their lives might have been like if they had lived. "We were supposed to grow up together," said Jennifer Walsh, who had been in Mrs. Anderson's 5th grade class when the 6th graders vanished. "We were supposed to go to middle school together, high school, college. We were supposed to be at each other's weddings and watch our kids grow up together. Instead, we've spent 30 years missing them and wondering what could have been." The memorial service also honored the 3 adults who had died trying to protect their students. Mrs. Patricia Williams was remembered as a dedicated educator who had given her life for her students. Dr. Robert Chen was celebrated as a community leader who had volunteered his time to ensure the children's safety. Hal Peterson was recognized as a faithful employee who had tried to keep his passengers safe, even in the face of armed criminals. "These adults died as heroes," said Superintendent Michael Rodriguez during his eulogy. "They could have tried to save themselves, but they chose to stay with the children in their care. Their courage and dedication represent the best of what educators and community members can be." The criminal investigation concluded in March 2025 with the arrest of 3 additional suspects connected to the Morrison-Jenkins criminal network. These individuals, now in their 60s and 70s, were charged with conspiracy, accessory to murder, and obstruction of justice for their roles in planning the kidnapping and covering up the crime. The trials revealed the full scope of the conspiracy for the first time. Morrison and Jenkins had been part of a criminal organization that specialized in kidnapping for ransom, targeting wealthy families throughout Northern California. The Pine Ridge school bus had been chosen because the kidnappers believed that the families in the community had more money than they actually did. The plan had been to hold the children for several weeks while demanding ransom payments from each family. However, the criminals had underestimated both the FBI's response and the financial resources of the Pine Ridge families. When it became clear that the families couldn't pay the demanded ransoms and that law enforcement was closing in, Morrison and Jenkins had decided to eliminate all witnesses. This was a crime of pure greed that escalated into mass murder, said federal prosecutor Sarah Williams, no relation to the teacher, during closing arguments. These criminals saw 15 innocent children as nothing more than dollar signs, and when their plan failed, they chose murder over mercy. All 3 remaining conspirators were convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The convictions brought legal closure to the case, though many questions about the extent of the criminal network remained unanswered. The families of the victims were finally able to lay their loved ones to rest in a special section of Pine Ridge Memorial Cemetery that was dedicated to the memory of the 18 victims. Each grave was marked with a headstone that included not only the victim's name and dates, but also their dreams and aspirations as remembered by their families. Tommy Martinez's headstone read, "Class clown, future comedian, beloved son, he made everyone laugh." Sarah Chen's marker said, "Future scientist, curious mind, loving daughter, she wanted to change the world." Jake Morrison's stone proclaimed, "Star athlete, team captain, devoted son, he never gave up." The burial service was private, attended only by immediate family members and close friends. It was a somber but necessary conclusion to 30 years of uncertainty and grief. Many of the families expressed relief that they finally had a place to visit their loved ones and a sense that their children could finally rest in peace. The Pine Ridge case led to significant changes in school safety protocols across California and eventually throughout the United States. New requirements were implemented for field trip supervision, background checks for all school employees and volunteers, and communication procedures for school buses traveling outside their districts. A national database was created to track school bus locations in real time, and emergency communication systems were installed in all school buses to ensure that help could be summoned immediately if needed. These changes came too late for the Pine Ridge victims, but they would help protect countless other children in the years to come. The case also led to advances in cold case investigation techniques. The combination of traditional detective work, advanced forensic science, and new technologies like ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis had solved a case that had seemed hopeless for decades. Law enforcement agencies across the country began applying these same techniques to other long, unsolved cases. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, the geologist whose work had led to the discovery of the cave, was honored by the National Park Service for her contribution to solving the case. She continued her research in cave systems, but also became an advocate for using scientific technology to solve cold cases. Science gave these families answers that traditional investigation couldn't provide, Dr. Rodriguez said. If we can use our knowledge and technology to bring closure to even one family, then we have an obligation to do so. The Pine Ridge Memorial Elementary School established a scholarship fund in honor of the 18 victims, providing financial assistance to students who wanted to pursue careers in education, medicine, or public safety. The fund was supported by donations from around the world and had helped hundreds of students achieve their educational goals. The memorial room at the school was expanded to include interactive exhibits about child safety and the importance of community vigilance. Students from across the country visited the school to learn about the tragedy and the investigation that finally solved it. Pine Ridge itself had been forever changed by the events of 1994 and their resolution 30 years later. The community had learned to balance the need to remember and honor the victims with the desire to move forward and heal. The town's annual Memorial Day on October 14th became a celebration of the victims' lives rather than a focus on their deaths. The families who remained in Pine Ridge found ways to keep their children's memories alive through community service and advocacy work. Maria Santos established an art program for underprivileged children, believing that her daughter would have wanted to share her love of creativity with others. The Chen family endowed a science scholarship at the local high school, hoping to inspire other young people to pursue Sarah's dream of becoming a scientist. Carol Morrison, Jake's sister, expanded her foundation to include programs for missing children's families, providing support and resources to help them cope with uncertainty and grief. Her work had helped dozens of families navigate the difficult journey of searching for missing loved ones. "We can't bring them back," Carol said, "but we can make sure their legacy is one of hope and healing rather than just tragedy and loss." The resolution of the Pine Ridge case also brought closure to many of the law enforcement officers who had worked on the investigation over the years. Detective Linda Martinez, who had led the initial investigation in 1994, had retired years earlier but remained haunted by the case. When Agent Thompson called to tell her about the discovery, Detective Martinez wept openly for the first time since the children had vanished. "I never stopped thinking about those kids," Detective Martinez said. "Every case I worked after that, I kept hoping I would find some clue that would lead us back to them. Knowing that they've finally been found and can be properly buried, it's like a weight has been lifted from my soul." Agent Thompson, who had devoted the last 3 years of her career to solving the case, announced her retirement shortly after the convictions were secured. She had achieved what many thought was impossible, bringing justice to the victims and closure to their families after 30 years. "This case taught me that we should never give up hope," Agent Thompson said during her retirement ceremony. "Technology changes, evidence can be reanalyzed, and new witnesses can come forward. As long as there are families who need answers, we have to keep searching." The story of the Pine Ridge children became the subject of books, documentaries, and academic studies about both the criminal investigation and the community's response to tragedy. Researchers studied how the town had coped with the loss and uncertainty, and how the eventual resolution had affected the healing process. Psychologists noted that the families who had maintained hope throughout the 30-year ordeal generally coped better with the final resolution than those who had given up hope early on. The importance of community support and the role of advocacy groups in sustaining families through long-term trauma became models for other communities facing similar tragedies. The Pine Ridge case also highlighted the importance of never closing missing person cases, even when leads have been exhausted and hope seems lost. The advancement of technology and investigative techniques meant that cases considered unsolvable in one era might be cracked in another. Today, visitors to Yosemite National Park can see a small memorial plaque near Tunnel View, marking the approximate location where the hidden cave was discovered. The plaque doesn't sensationalize the tragedy, but simply commemorates the 18 victims and acknowledges the dedicated work of the investigators who never gave up searching for them. The cave itself was permanently sealed after the investigation was completed, both to preserve it as evidence and to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. The National Park Service felt that the victims deserved to have their final resting place treated with dignity and respect. Pine Ridge Elementary School continues to educate children from kindergarten through 8th grade, just as it did in 1994. The current students learn about the tragedy as part of their local history curriculum, But the focus is on the positive legacy of the victims and the importance of community resilience in the face of adversity. Mrs. Williams's sixth-grade classroom has been restored to active use, but a corner of the room is dedicated to her memory and that of her students. New sixth graders are taught about their predecessors and encouraged to live up to their example of curiosity, kindness, and courage. The yellow school bus that carried the victims to their fate was eventually removed from the cave and transported to a secure facility where it was processed for evidence. After the investigation was completed, the bus was quietly destroyed, with the family's agreement that it should not become a morbid artifact or tourist attraction. However, a replica of bus number 47 was created for display at the Pine Ridge Community Center, where it serves as part of the memorial exhibit. Visitors can walk through the replica to understand the victims' experience while learning about school safety and the investigation that finally brought them justice. The story of the 15 children who vanished on a field trip to Yosemite in 1994 serves as a reminder that even the most innocent activities can be affected by evil, but also that persistence, community support, and advancing technology can eventually bring justice even in the most hopeless cases. For the families who waited 30 years for answers, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. They had their loved ones back, and they had justice, but they could never have back the years that were stolen from them. Yet in their grief, they found purpose, using their experience to help other families and to ensure that their children's memory would serve as a force for good in the world. The Pine Ridge case closed officially on December 15, 2025, with the completion of all legal proceedings and the final burial of evidence. But for the community of Pine Ridge and the families of the victims, the real end came much earlier, the moment they were finally able to bring their children home.